everyone, welcome to my March wrap-up. Apologies if you can hear a little bit of noise in the background. There's a lot of wind, and even though my windows are fully closed, I can still hear it creep through. I decided to dedicate a full video to my March wrap-up because I read a lot, and I'm also going to cheat a little bit and talk about the first book that I read in April because it'll make sense when I talk about it. But I actually ended up reading 9 books last month, and so in the interest of time, I'm not going to focus too much or too long on the summaries for each of these books because I don't want this to be too long. But I had a really good reading month overall, I would say. First book that I read last month was Post-Traumatic by Chantal V. Johnson. This follows Vivian. She is a lawyer and she is grappling with the long-term effects of childhood trauma, compounded with the realities of being a Black Latinx woman in the United States, specifically in New York City. I adored this book. I had so much fun reading it. This was the perfect book to come out of my little February reads, which were a lot more grim. This book was really, really funny, and I love that it didn't shy away from the humor. There's a lot of dark humor, which I found really funny, and I related to Vivian a lot as a character, specifically in the beginning, and the story was so fun to follow because in the beginning you get familiar with Vivian and her coping mechanisms, her habits to protect herself, or her behaviors that are definitely impacted by her trauma, and she is a very relatable character in the beginning, and then she becomes more and more morally gray. She starts making bad decisions, but I found that because I really liked her in the beginning, I wanted her to make the bad decisions. I was rooting for her to make the bad decisions because it would make the story more funny and more enjoyable to read. This reminded me in some ways of My Year of Rest and Relaxation. I can't really explain why because I haven't read My Year of Rest and Relaxation in years, so I don't remember enough of that book to actually really compare them, but I guess the dark humor aspect of Post-Traumatic reminded me of Tessa Moshfegh. This one is definitely going to be on my top lists of 2025. I really, really liked this book and I would recommend it to anyone. I was also shocked because there was something that Vivian does, the way that she acts, that I unfortunately related to a lot, and it was so interesting to see someone grappling with the aftermath of trauma, but such a long time after, and not in a only very serious way, which I know that it's really important for a lot of books to tackle trauma in a very serious emotional way, but it was refreshing to also see it in this way where it's like, yeah, it impacts you so much that you start, not always making the right decisions, but it also doesn't ruin you as a person fully, if that makes sense. I'm gonna stop talking about this one. After that, I wanted to reread My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. This is the first book in the Neapolitan Quartet where we follow Lila and Lenu, who are 2 girls who live in a poor neighborhood in Naples. They form a very, very close friendship amidst the violence of their neighborhood, which is touched by a lot of poverty, so there's a lot of conversations about money and what it meant to be a girl in the 50s in Italy at that time. Elena Ferrante has one of the most magnificent writing. It's actually a little, I wouldn't say dense, but it takes you longer to read than other fiction books because there's a lot of description and not that much dialogue compared to a lot of other books, and the way that she writes her sentences, it's usually in a very poetic, long way and not necessarily supernatural, but it works and flows very well. She has a very distinct voice, which I really like, and the story just means so much to me. I found myself tearing up almost throughout the entire book, not because it was necessarily sad for me, but because I loved the story so much. It was overwhelming, and when I'm overwhelmed, tears come to my eyes. So I was feeling a lot of, I think it's called exquisite sadness with this story. I can't wait to read the rest of the books in the quartet, but I know that I needed a bit of time. I do think I'm going to pick up the next one this month. And then I read another book which is going to be a favorite for sure, A Language of Limbs by Dylan Hardcastle. This is a little difficult to explain in terms of the plot because we are under the point of view of 2 people called Limbs. There is Limb 1 and Limb 2, and they both grapple with sexuality, specifically lesbian identities, in Australia in the 70s. So Limb 1 decides to embrace her sexuality while Limb 2 represses it. This is an extremely poetic book. The writing was beautiful. I hope and can't wait for Dylan Hardcastle to publish more because they write in such a magnificent way. The writing was delectable. I was very emotional throughout the entire read. I loved it so much that I am going to be writing a paper about it. The story itself is also so important, and I loved that they explored sexuality, but not in the way where it's obvious or it's supposed to convince you that you should embrace your sexuality. Both limbs go through so much pain, especially because of the AIDS crisis, which has a big role in this book, and there is also the first Sydney Mardi Gras. It teaches you about LGBTQ plus history in Australia without it being academic or actually trying to teach you about it. I think that Dylan Hardcastle did such an amazing job at writing this reality, and it needed to be written, and I'm so happy that it was written. In terms of books, it reminded me of Open Water by Caleb Azuma Nelson, in that it's a very poetic story, but still filled with so much love and so much important themes amidst just some of the best writing I've read, for sure. Then I read Big Swiss by Jen Began because I wanted something a little bit similar to Post-Traumatic, and this follows Greta, who is a transcriber. She transcribes the audio of a therapist, and she actually starts getting a little bit obsessed with one of his clients, who she calls Big Swiss, and then she meets Big Swiss in real life. I found this one to be fun and very enjoyable to read, but I wasn't fully connected to the story. Found it fun and I would recommend it, but it's not going to be on my mind a lot. I think that it's weird enough, a little crazy enough, and it's the kind of book that I really like, following a woman character who is going through it and starts making bad decisions. I love that. I just don't know if I connected enough with the main character, but at the same time, I still had a fun time. Yeah, I don't have much more to say about Big Swiss, so moving on. In the middle of March, I decided to pick up a quick romance. I actually talked about it in a vlog very quickly, but I decided to read Beg, Borrow, or Steal by Sarah Adams. I picked this one up because I knew it was a closed-door romance, which means that there's no explicit spicy scenes, and I liked the small town that it took place in, and from what I remembered, she isn't too intense on the very cringy TikTok mentions. I don't think there was any, if I remember correctly, which I again enjoy. In this book, we follow Emily, who is a teacher, and her nemesis Jackson, who goes by Jack, who is also a teacher, but he'd moved away with his fiance, but he's suddenly back in the small town, single, and he's going to be her neighbor. Now, like I said, they don't really get along. I wouldn't necessarily call them enemies or anything like that by any means. They just have a little childish feud going on. This very bantery back and forth, but neither of them are actually really mean to the other, which is very important for me personally, because I don't like an enemies to lovers contemporary romance, because I don't like when the MFC is mean. Like, that turns me off more than anything. But this one was just really more banter than anything, in my opinion. I had a fun time with this one. I think it's a good one to read if you're in a slump and you want something quick. The characters don't feel 100% believable, but they also don't feel too unreal, which is kind of where I draw the line with the romance. The writing is also not too simplistic to the point where it takes me out of the story. I just think it's a good romance. I had a fun time with that one, so I would recommend it. That being said, I don't think I necessarily related to the main characters that much, but I did really like the focus on teaching. I don't know why. I just liked that they were both teachers and authors. Then I read Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom. This might be one of the most popular memoirs written, honestly. It's an interesting form for a memoir because we follow Mitch, who finds out that his old college professor is really sick, terminally ill, and he gets back in contact with him, and his professor Morrie decides to teach him the lessons that he's learned from life, kind of to get Mitch back on track with loving life, I guess, really teaching him what's important in life. And I found it very sweet. I cried at the end. I grew attached to Morrie through this story. I think the writing was very simple, but not detached. You can really see how much both Morrie and Mitch cared for each other, which I really found heartwarming, and the lessons were nice reminders, even though it's a lot of things that you might have heard before. I think sometimes you just need a reminder of what's important in life. That being said, I will say this is a little privileged in a way because it talks about focusing on the people in your life and living life in the moment, etc., which is possible for people who can live that way, but there's a lot of people around the world who just don't have that privilege. And I think that despite the lessons being nice, kind of comes from a somewhat privileged position. But I still enjoyed it. If you're really feeling burnt out with the world and you need to refocus on something, it's a really nice book to have. And I do want to get a physical copy at some point because I think it's the type of book that you can revisit without necessarily rereading everything. So yeah, I'm really happy that I read that. During the course of the month, I also sporadically picked up Let Me Tell You What I Mean by Joan Didion, which I've talked about before, but I got this from a professor and I decided to read some of the essays once in a while during the month. I think this is going to be a new habit of mine, either with essay collections or short story collections. When I'm in between books, specifically usually when I finish a book in the morning and I'm just not yet ready to commit to something fully, I think it's nice to pick up a either essay collection or short story collection. I ended up watching the Netflix documentary before I picked this up, and then I did, and I enjoyed it to a certain extent. I think that her voice is very clear, despite this being the only work of hers that I've read, but because all the essay focus on such different themes, her voice is very familiar in every single one of them. I think she's an author that if I come across any of her work, I would be able to know that Joan Didion wrote it. That being said, my favorite essays in this collection were Alicia and the Underground Press, which is the first one, On Being Unchosen by the College of One's Choice. Why I Write was my favorite overall, and then I will also add Some Women because that one kind of touched on Robert Mapplethorpe, which I found really nice after having read Just Kids in February. I just am not sure that this is the best thing to pick up if you're trying to get into Didion's work, and this was the case for me. This was the first piece of writing that I read from her, and I think because this was published last, it's not necessarily her most popular essays, and I'm sure that she's written some more interesting works, at least things that I might be more interested in personally. I will say I enjoyed her writing enough that I really want to read some other of her works, specifically Slouching Towards Bethlehem and Play It As It Lays. But I would recommend this if you're a fan of hers. I just don't think that starting to get into Joan Didion with this was the best idea. Okay, and then to finish off the month, I was entering my final paper time at uni. So this is a coping mechanism that I built all the way back in 2020 when I have exam seasons or just very intense periods of school stuff. I tend to hide away in my books and binge read some romance books. And because I'd enjoyed Beg, Borrow, or Steal, I thought it would be a good idea to read some more romances to finish off the month. So I was listening to a lot of country music and I decided to read Lost and Lassoed by Lila Sage. This is the third book in the Rebel Blue Ranch series, which I read the first two a while back and enjoyed the first one. The second one, a little indifferent. This one, I will say, was not for me. This was a single dad, enemies to lovers. We follow a writer who is a little overwhelmed with taking care of the entire ranch, and his daughter's mom is out of the small town for a little bit, so he has to take care of his daughter alone, but he actually just does not have enough time to properly take care of her, so he hires a nanny who is his sister's best friend. They don't get along, but this is his only option. But yeah, I just didn't really enjoy that one. I think what I enjoyed actually most out of the book was the third act conflict. It was a little refreshing to read that compared to a lot of other romance books, but I don't think I liked their dynamic, and I'm someone who doesn't like spicy scenes. Very few authors where I can actually read them and enjoy them. Most of the time I will skip over them, so this time I had to because they're very intense. Really not my thing. But yeah, I found it cringy more than anything. To me, it was my least favorite of the series, and I don't think I will read the fourth one because me, who read those kinds of books and enjoyed them, is in the past, and I will leave her to the past. Yeah. And then I was watching some Heather McClary vlogs. I love her videos. I love her vlogs. They're some of my favorites to watch. This one was an old video, and in it she read Not Another Love Song by Julie Soto and loved the book, and that made me really want to read that. I just wanted to binge another romance. So this one is actually another Reylo fanfiction, and I should have known. I didn't know, but I should have known because I didn't dislike it as much as Lost and Lassoed, but it didn't work for me much either. We follow Gwen and Xander Thorne. They're both professional musicians. Gwen is a violinist, Xander is a cellist, and Gwen gets offered the first chair position, which was out Alex's dream, so he is a little jealous of her because of that. In the beginning, he's really mean to her, which is something that I did not like, but then it got better. I will say in like the middle, I liked it in the middle, and then it started going down again. Really appreciated the fact that there was a lot of focus on the music. Actually, there was a lot of musical terms and a lot of focus on them playing their instruments and the life of professional musicians, I guess. But a lot of the way that they connected with each other was through music. The way that they spoke about their emotions with one another was through music, and because obviously I couldn't hear the music, to me it felt like their relationship was really more of just a physical obsession. It passed the time, but it's just not a favorite. And then finally, this book was not read in March, but still want to talk about it. I read The Right Move by Liz Tomford. This is a best friend's brother, forced proximity, fake dating romance. We follow Indy and Ryan. Indy has just gone through something pretty intense and she has nowhere to live, and so her best friend tells her to move in with her brother, Ryan, which is what she does. Ryan is a professional basketball player. This is one of the books that people rave about because of the NMC. I will say does do some good acts of service actions to show his love, which I enjoyed. I am not someone who loves a possessive guy, and there was a few times where he repeated things like "she's mine," and that really gave me the ick more than anything. I also found it a little long. I don't think it needed to be that long. I can completely understand why people loved it. It's just not necessarily my preferred type of romance, and I thought that rereading and binging some romance books would kind of get me back like this with the romance genre, but really it hasn't, which is a little disappointing. I am going to be rereading Happy Place pretty soon, but after that I'm just going to give it a rest. Emily Henry to me does not read the same way as a lot of other contemporary romance authors do. Yeah, I just think that I can still enjoy a romance book. I think I need a long break in between them to really like them. Not talking about Emily Henry, but I also think that maybe one of the reasons that I stopped loving them as much as I used to is that the writing feels very similar in every single one of them, and they get very repetitive because of the genre's conventions, I guess. Yeah, that's all the books that I read in March and the first book of April. I hope you enjoyed this, even though the end was a little bit disappointing. I'm really excited for April to get back into literary fiction and to read some books that have been on my radar. Let me know what were your favorite books of March. Mine, as I said, were A Language of Limbs and Post-Traumatic. Special mention for My Brilliant Friend, but that was a reread. But yeah, thank you for sticking all the way till the end. I'll see you soon.